The crowd closed like curtains when Helen Carter pointed and said, "He stole my watch." Marcus lifted his hands. Too late, while Officer Daniel Price stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Someone's phone recorded the cuffs. Another screen lit up with a photo and a cash transfer receipt. David stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a pale confession, the friend who had bargained betrayal. The watch on Marcus's wrist kept ticking, indifferent as the town began to pick a story to believe. By nightfall, one small lie had already begun to rewrite every life it touched. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. Marcus stood by the window of the small kitchen and watched the city move like a tired river. Heat shimmered off the pavement, making the streetlights look soft and wrong even though it was still morning. A bus hissed past and left a smell of diesel and warm bread. From somewhere nearby, a child laughed, high and quick. Then the sound vanished between buildings. Marcus breathed in and tried to hold himself steady. Today felt heavy the way summer air feels heavy, dense, full of things that do not sit right. He wrapped his fingers around the band of his watch as if that could anchor him. The watch was bright, not because it had to be, but because his uncle had given it to him when Marcus turned 18. It was smooth against his skin, a small, careful defiance that said, "Quietly, I made something of myself." He liked how the metal caught the light, how the hands moved with a small, honest tick. He had planned to wear it to the interview at the design firm. The job was important, not just for money, though the bills on the counter did not care about meaning. It was important because it told Marcus he could be someone in a town that had little use for boys like him. His mother, Sarah, moved about the kitchen without looking at him. She poured coffee into 2 chip mugs and set one down with a hand that trembled a fraction. She did not say much this morning. She never loved to talk when worry lived on her shoulders. Sarah had taught Marcus how to fix a bicycle chain and how to stand when a stranger looked at him the wrong way. She had taught him to smile at the right times and to hold his head high at the wrong ones. She had given him rules that were both shield and weight. "Traffic will be bad," she said finally. "Take the earlier bus. Don't dawdle." Her voice was practical, the way language softens into habit when it tries to protect. Marcus nodded. He kissed her cheek, felt the little map of lines there, the proof of years. He wanted to tell her that the interview could change things, that this project could be the beginning of more. But words stuck like gum. He had learned to say less and mean more. The watch felt warm where it touched his wrist like company. Outside, the building smelled of laundry soap and hot asphalt. The hallway light buzzed. Marcus met David on the stairs. David with his school books still slung over one shoulder, his grin wide and untroubled. David had a way of cutting through worry with jokes. He clapped Marcus on the back and said, "Big day, man. Break their brains." Marcus laughed because he liked the way David believed in him. They walked to the bus stop together. On the corner, Mrs. Langley watered geraniums in the same thin blue bucket she had used for years. The flowers drooped a little from heat, their red petals like small flags. Marcus noticed how the neighborhood moved and kept moving despite the small cracks that ran through it, despite the boarded windows on the block over. It was a place that both hardened and held people, like an old coin worn at the edges but staying valuable because it had been in so many hands. Marcus felt the town's eyes on him even when no one looked directly. He had learned the language of glances and silence. He knew when a door would close a little quicker if he passed, knew which bell to avoid and which streetlight made him uneasy. These were skills he had earned without asking. They were part of how he walked through the world. At the bus stop, a police cruiser idled for a moment across the avenue and then rolled off. Marcus did not look up. He had seen that car before, Officer Daniel Price on long patrols, the same square jaw, and the same way his shoulders set like a wall. Price smiled at some people in a way that made them think he was harmless. He smiled others the way a hawk smiles at a field. Marcus had heard people say Price was strict, that he kept order. He also knew stories. Small ones that arrived in the grocery store aisle or on the corner like bad weather, stories of stops that turned long, of men who came home with bruised hands and bitter mouths. Those stories were not. For breakfast, Marcus fingered the watch again. It felt like history and like promise in the same breath. He had bought new clothes for the interview, a shirt that lay flat over his chest, shoes polished until his reflection stared back. He wanted to be the person they would remember for skill, for ideas, not because his skin made anyone uncomfortable. The watch was a quiet argument with the world. He deserved to shine. The bus arrived, doors sighing open like an invitation. Marcus and David climbed aboard and found 2 seats by the window. The city moved past in a blur of color and noise. A man balancing crates on his shoulder, a woman singing into a phone, a dog that barked at a pigeon, and then seemed to forget entirely. Marcus watched himself reflected in the glass, a young man with a careful face and a watch that glinted. For a moment, there was a peace that had nothing to do with tomorrow. He let his eyes close and counted heartbeats. But peace is a fragile thing. An impartial voice, the kind that observes without mercy, might say Marcus carried more than hope onto that bus. He carried the weight of being watched, the weight of other people's expectations, and the small, stubborn flame that said he did not belong to any of those weights. He was trying in one small morning to tip the scale. When the bus turned the corner, a motorcycle wheeled past and someone shouted. Marcus opened his eyes. He felt the old, low hum of worry, that feeling like a hand at the back of his neck, and he tightened his grip on the watch without meaning to. The metal sang faintly against the skin. It was a tiny sound, lost among the rumble of the engine and the city's size, but it felt like an answer. Keep going. He did not know then that a single glance, a single decision, could tilt everything. He only knew that he had a place to be and a small armor on his wrist. The day had begun, and the city waited with its quiet, patient attention. The morning had bent toward noon when the small, ordinary thing happened that split Marcus's day in 2. He had stepped off the bus 2 blocks from the firm, the sun pressing heat into his collar. He walked with careful steps, the way someone keeps a fragile thing from tipping over. The watch on his wrist felt heavier now, not from weight, but from meaning. It was still warm where his skin met metal. He stopped at a newsstand to check the address. A boy inside the stall, soft hat pulled low, pointed toward a narrow street that cut between a pawn shop and a barber shop. Marcus thanked him and turned. At that moment, someone nearby laughed too loudly, a laugh like glass, sharp and surprised, and a voice called out, "Hey, that's my watch." The sound came from the street, from a woman whose hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. Her eyes were hard and wet at once. Marcus turned, heart folding into his throat. He had not noticed the woman before. She stood by an expensive black sedan, her lips white. "You took it," she cried. "You took my watch." Her voice opened like a headline. People paused. A man in a suit peered out of the coffee shop doorway and then looked away. Mrs. Langley, who had been watering geraniums, stopped and watched with her hands on her hips, mouth drawn thin. Even the dog in the window stopped barking. Marcus lifted his hands without thinking. "Ma'am, I think you've made a mistake. This watch was a gift from my uncle. I bought it back home." His voice sounded smaller than he felt. He said the words carefully, like placing a tool into a machine, careful, precise. The woman did not calm down. She stepped closer, fingers pointing at the metal on his wrist. Her face had a color that meant accusation. "That's mine," she said again. "It has an engraving. I saw it this morning." A crowd collected more quickly than Marcus liked. They were easy to find in a small town. Curiosity gathers like water. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else murmured agreement. The man in the suit finally came back, but only to stand under the awning where the shade made him anonymous. A siren wailed distantly and grew larger. A cruiser rounded the corner and idled in the middle of the street. Officer Daniel Price climbed out, one hand on his belt, the other shading his eyes. He had a reputation that reached Marcus's ears long before this moment, reputation like a rumor that sits under your skin. Price's badge caught the sunlight and made a thin star on his chest. He smiled, the kind of smile that did not meet his eyes. "What's the problem here?" Price asked, voice steady like an announcement. He stepped between Marcus and the woman, as if the space itself needed an adult to hold it together. The woman pointed at Marcus like she had been given a map. "He stole my watch. I saw him run off with it." Her words were clean, hard, and practiced. Marcus felt the world tilt. He tried to explain again that this was a gift that his uncle had given him at his 18th. He spoke the truth but found it thin when it met people's belief in what they already wanted to see. Price asked for ID. Marcus offered it with fingers that trembled a fraction. Price rifled through it with an efficiency that felt rehearsed. He watched Marcus like a man who had decided the story already and only needed the final sentence. The woman's statement fit neatly into the box Price had already imagined. A young black man wearing a nice watch. There was a story the town told itself and Price read it on sight. Someone recorded the interaction on their phone. The angle showed Marcus's face, the watch, Price's hands. David stood near the curb, his backpack hanging like a gesture of innocence. He moved closer when Marcus called his name, "David." For a second their eyes met. David's were wide, torn. Then the boy looked down at his shoes as if remembering homework he had left. He froze in the crowd's heat. Marcus felt a loneliness there that cut deeper than cuffs. Price's voice changed, lowering into a tone that made people lean back. "Sir, you're under arrest for possession of stolen property," he said. He spoke the words with the calmness of someone reciting an ordinary form. His hands closed around Marcus's wrists with a practiced touch. The metal of the handcuffs was colder than the watch. Click! The sound made the crowd breathe in and then hold it, collective, sharp. "Please," Marcus said, "this is a mistake. I can show you my uncle. There's a receipt." His words skidded and did not find purchase. The woman repeated her accusation, her voice steady now, stronger because it had been answered. People nodded as if the pieces matched. The man in the suit stepped back into the coffee shop, pulling his collar up, as if a breeze of trouble might catch on him otherwise. Price leaned in for a moment, his face close enough that Marcus could see the small, dry line at the corner of his eye. "You know how it is, son," Price said quietly, as if he were offering advice. "Sometimes folks take things they can't afford. Sometimes they run. We can sort this out at the station." His tone suggested a kindness that was less balm than a small, meticulous knife. A woman in the crowd muttered, "Finally, someone doing their job." Another voice said nothing at all, but the absence of protest weighed like a duvet. Marcus's heart thudded in a way that was all muscle. He felt, strangely and fiercely, how public shame made hidden things visible. The watch on his wrist flashed, once stubborn and private, then lay mute against the steel. As they led him away, Marcus glanced back. David's face was pale under his cap, eyes wet but empty of motion. Mrs. Langley started with an expression too complicated for a single page. The man who had recorded the scene watched the screen of his phone, as if what it held mattered more now than the person in it. Betrayal, Marcus thought, with a cold clarity, was not always loud. Sometimes betrayal arrives in the small, still places. The turn of someone's shoulder, the silence of a friend, the ready hand of authority that chooses the story it will believe. He held the watch as if it were a map. He did not yet know who would open it or how. Marcus sat on the hard bench in the interview room and felt the paint of the walls pressing close, as if the color itself wanted an answer. The watch lay on his palm now, removed at the station and set on the metal table like an exhibit. Up close, the engraving was faint, James, 18. He turned it over with a finger and remembered his Uncle James's laugh, the small prayer he had whispered when he gave it. The memory was private and bright. Here, under fluorescent lights, it felt fragile. Sarah had arrived at the station an hour later, breathless and trembling, but with the kind of calm that could only come from fear tightened into purpose. Her hands smoothed Marcus's hair the way she had when he was small. She kept calling him my boy in half commands and half apologies. "I told you to take the early bus," she said to him once, the words more to settle her own anger than to blame him. When she spoke to the officers, her voice stayed steady. She had an old habit of measuring sentences so they would land clean. "Do you have a lawyer yet?" someone asked. It was David's mother, Karen, who had come with her son. She pressed a folded card into Sarah's hand, an offer of help that tasted of neighborhood solidarity. David stood apart, hands tucked into his jacket like a boy who wanted to shrink. He kept glancing toward Marcus, then away. When Sarah looked up at him, there was a flash of something in his face, fear or calculation. Marcus caught that look, and it lodged itself like a question. "You okay?" Marcus asked David when they were alone for a heartbeat in the corridor. David's jaw worked. He said, "I'm sorry, Marcus." Then he stopped. The apology was small and honest and not enough. Marcus saw David's shoulders because David could not meet his eyes. That silence taught him something he had not wanted to learn. Under pressure, people shape themselves to fit whatever is safest. It hurt because Marcus had thought their friendship was one small, unbreakable thing. Officer Daniel Price walked the precinct with an easy stride, the kind that made rules look like manners. To the other officers, he was precise and effective. To some, he was a man of ambitions larger than this town. He took things seriously, order, record, commendation. When he brought Marcus in, he wore a face that said the town had been saved from another careless act. He liked the neatness of his work: complaint, evidence, arrest. In private, Price told himself he had done right. He told himself he kept people safe. Those tidy self-justifications had a way of muting the part of him that might wonder if he had made a mistake. Helen Carter, the woman who had accused Marcus, sat stiff as a ruler in a folding chair in the hallway. She folded and refolded a paper napkin until it lost its corners. When Sarah confronted her with the engraving, Helen's hands paused, and for a breath, she looked almost like someone who might break. Then she steadied and said, "I'm sure. I know what mine looks like." Her voice was thin and practiced. Marcus watched her and had the odd sense that she was playing a role she had been given to play. Her eyes avoided him when she spoke. She kept glancing at her phone, as if waiting for a message that would forgive her. Mrs. Langley came by and rested a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I saw it," she said quietly. "You know I see a lot on the street." Her presence was a small anchor. She represented the parts of the neighborhood that remembered the long arc of people's lives. She had watched Marcus grow from a skinny boy to a quiet young man who always tipped his hat. Her look at David was sharp. She did not like the way he had retreated. In the bullpen, talk moved like low tide, officers trading small, safe opinions. Price answered questions with the same measured calm. When a sergeant asked if there was any proof beyond the accusation, Price said, "We'll check the engraving, the serial number. If she's right, we'll file." In his mind, the case was an ordinary thing. But ambition can be a shapeshifter. It could make a man see opportunity where there was routine. Price thought a clear case now might help his record. He did not, at that moment, weigh how the noise of an arrest would sound to the family waiting in the hallway. Back in the room, Marcus tried to explain to Sarah how the watch came to him, but every description sounded like defense, and his words failed to cover what the world heard first: a black young man with something fine on his wrist. He noticed how people folded their beliefs into spaces left by facts. He had always known the town's stories could swallow truth, but recognizing it and having it happen were different things. David stayed long enough to say he would wait outside. He lingered at the door and then walked away slowly, his steps a soft confession. Marcus watched him go and let himself be surprised by the sting of betrayal. Small, not dramatic, but real. The feeling bent him inward like wind on a leaning sapling. He had hoped for courage from others and felt the new, sharp knowledge that courage often costs people more than they want to pay. That night, in the small apartment that smelled of boiled coffee and old books, Sarah sat with Marcus and listened to him tell the story again, each retelling a way to test its shape. She dialed numbers, paced, held her son's wrist with a tenderness that wanted to make truth tangible. Marcus saw, beneath her worry, a hardening resolve. She would not let this be the end of him. In her eyes, he was not the accusation, he was the boy she had watched learn to fix a chain, tie a tie, and say thank you. Outside, the city continued. Shops closed, lights blinked on, the distant hum of tires stitched the night. Somewhere, a camera's feed was already being watched, and a recording of the street sat in someone's phone. Small images accumulate into stories, and stories can change hands. Marcus slept poorly, with the watch neatly wrapped in a napkin on the table beside his bed, the engraving like a promise he could not yet prove. The day had opened a wound that would not heal easily. It demanded answers and perhaps revealed who would stand and who would step aside. They brought a thin folder into the room, like it was fragile, like the truth inside could cut if it was bent the wrong way. Marcus watched the paper slide across the table, and the lawyer, an anxious, kind-faced man named Paul, opened it with gentle fingers. For a long second, Marcus only saw the inked words on the header, the hospital straight lines of type that made everything look official. Then Paul pointed at a page and said, "Look at this." It was a string of messages, small, bright squares of text pulled from Helen Carter's phone. Marcus read them like someone watching a slow-motion replay of a bad decision. The words were simple: a photo of Marcus with the watch, a confirmation, he'll be there, then cash ready, then a small blue check that meant the message was seen. The phone's timestamps were a map of a plan. Marcus's mouth went dry. He felt Sarah's hand on his knee, steady but shaking a little, and he turned to find David in the doorway. David's face had the kind of paleness that looks like someone who has not eaten, as if fear had been gnawing at him all day. He stepped forward because Paul asked him to, but his legs moved like a man pulled by ropes. "You set me up?" Marcus said, but the question came thinner than he wanted. It hung between them like steam. David swallowed and looked at his shoes. His voice was small, scraped thing. "I didn't mean," he tried to explain and then dropped back because words were not strong enough. The messages in the folder did not need his explanation. They were an honest, ugly shape on the page. Helen's texts included a photograph of Marcus from earlier in the day, taken from behind the watch-catching light, then a line that said, "I'll say he grabbed it." Underneath, another message, $100 now, $200 when it's done. The name attached to the payment was not a bank. It was a cash exchange confirmation that went straight to David's phone number. Marcus felt the room tilt. Betrayal is a physical thing, he learned then. It landed in the chest like a punch. David had been the friend who made jokes about bad teachers, who came to Marcus's mother's Sunday dinners and ate the last slice of pie with a grin. He had been the boy who taught Marcus the secret route through the park when they were 12. The messages read like a knife in a pocket you forgot you had. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking, not because she wanted to shout, but because she wanted a place to put the shock. David's eyes flicked to her and then away. He had no answer that would stitch what his hands had done back together. Paul pushed the folder across to Officer Price after he was called in. Price studied the messages with a face that said he had been surprised and annoyed more than anything else, annoyed that something important might be slipping from his control. Price's jaw tightened. When someone asks you to believe in law, you learn quickly whether the law is a shield or a tool. Daniel Price's hands had always been tidy with their work. He put the folder down and said, "We'll look into the payment." His voice sounded practical, like someone who untangles rope knots for a living. But the knot unspooled into something worse. Paul had dug deeper, overnight. A neighbor had recorded a clip from a second camera, someone's doorbell, one that caught a sliver of the early morning. The footage showed David standing on the corner that morning, his hands tucked under his jacket. A single frame caught him slipping something small into Helen Carter's hand, a quick, furtive motion beneath the wash of a streetlight. Helen looked at the object, nodded, and walked away. The camera did not show the object clearly, the pixels blurred, but it showed intent. When Paul ran the images in the room, the sound of a watch ticking seemed to occupy the silence. David finally spoke then, words like glass underfoot. He said, "I needed money. My dad, he owes people. They said if I could help make something happen, they'd leave us alone for a while." He looked at Marcus, with an apology that was a thread of truth knotted with cowardice. I thought I was helping. I thought it would be small. Marcus saw the confession and felt the strange geometry of guilt and pity cross his chest. He wanted to be angry, raging, loud, the kind of anger that rewrites the room, but instead he felt hollowed out, as if his own insides had been rearranged by someone else. David's betrayal was not a sudden monstrous thing. It had been a quiet collapse, a series of small choices that made a lie look like survival. But the twist did not end there. As Paul pressed on, other threads appeared. Phone records showed that David had been in contact with an unlisted number tied to a man named Liam Parker, an operator who lent money and took more. Liam's name was whispered in storefronts and grocery lines, like a warning no one wanted to say out loud. Paul's fingers paused on the printout where the time-stamped calls met Daniel Price's shift log. A gap puckered in the neat story they had been telling themselves. Price had been nearby when one of the crucial texts was sent. It was not proof of collusion yet, but it made the neat lines blur. Helen's face, once a single source of accusation, shifted into something else in Marcus's mind. Not only an accuser, but a small actor in a larger arrangement. The woman who had cried and pointed on the street had done so with a phone full of messages and a cash transfer that bought a story. David, who had been Marcus's running partner through puddles and late-night projects, had chosen a path that put his family first and his friends second. And Daniel Price, who had stepped into the center of the street with his badge like a son, had the kind of ambition that could look like duty or like a very sharp ladder. Marcus watched them all as if he were outside his body, seeing the pieces move. The betrayal made everything more complicated. This was no longer only about a watch or a single lie. It was a website. Money and fear and small cruelties had braided together to make an accusation that looked airtight until a thin folder and a neighbor's camera unwound it. The revelation nested new questions under the old one. Who had profit from his arrest, and how deep did the arrangement go? At the end of the meeting, Paul closed the folder with a gentle, decisive sound. "This changes things," he said. The words were a soft promise and a warning. Marcus understood the room would not be the same after this. The street outside kept breathing, a city indifferent and persistent, but inside Marcus's chest a new plan began to take shape, a plan braided from anger, from a need to pull at the strings and see what else might fall. The days folded onto each other like pressed shirts, each crease a new worry. News of the arrest had leaked in the small, hungry way things leak in a town. A half-remembered story turned into a fact once someone with a phone decided it was worth sharing. The video on the man's phone, frame after frame of Marcus being cuffed, spread faster than any careful truth. It arrived at the design firm before Marcus did. His interview was quietly moved to another week. His name was a footnote in someone else's schedule. The watch, wrapped now in a napkin on the kitchen table, felt heavier than ever, as if its metal remembered every eye that had seen it. Paul's voice was steady but urgent. "You can settle this quietly," he said more than once, as if the option were currency. "A small fine, community service. Keep your record clean." He set the legal pathways out like a map with clear roads and a dangerous mountain marked off to the side. The public fight. Paul knew the law's rhythms, how quickly a town forgets or how quickly it rages. But if you want to expose what we've found, David's messages, the cash transfers, that's a different fight. It'll be messy. It'll be public. Marcus listened and felt the pull of both roads. Quiet would mean the least risk to his mother, to David's family, to the fragile piece of the block. But quiet would also mean the lie hardened into something that would follow him whenever someone glanced a little too long at his sleeve. Going public could clear his name. It could also make Price angry in a way that wasn't tidy. Angry men with ambitions do not like losing their stories. Marcus thought of Officer Price's smile, how it did not touch his eyes. He thought of the neat way Price had closed in on him that morning and the readiness of other hands to agree. At home, Sarah watched him like a woman listening for a cough in sleep, waiting for a sign. She kept telling him to be careful, to think first of safety. "They'll watch us now," she said one evening, voice small. "People who want trouble smell it. Don't make it worse." Her hands moved over the cups in the sink slowly, like an old rhythm meant to center her. Marcus wanted to promise her calm things. All he could promise was the truth in his chest. David avoided Marcus like a boy avoiding a hurt animal. When Marcus finally found him on the stoop of the corner shop, David's eyes were wild with guilt and something else, fear or shame that had teeth. "They came after my dad," David said, voice a rush. "I didn't have a choice. Liam, he said he'd take the house. He said if I didn't help," he trailed off, words melting into the brick. Marcus saw the smallness of David's shoulders, the way a boy could be broken into decisions by fear. And he saw the exchange record again, cold proof that their friendship had been bought. "You never thought to tell me?" Marcus asked, not as a shout, but as a cut. "You never thought I could help?" The question hung like an accusation and a plea braided together. David's answer was the kind that leaves a bruise. "I thought protecting my family was more important than you arguing with me." It felt like a confession and a defense born from someone still learning the shape of adult choices. Outside the precinct, Liam Parker's shadow breathed over the neighborhood. He had the soft voice of someone who sold relief and took more in return. His men hung near the arcade, leaning like dark statues on bright afternoons. A friend of David's said he'd seen Liam watching the street the night the messages were sent, a cigarette smoldering in his fingers. Threats arrived as small, tidy packages, veiled warnings left in unlocked cars, a text with just 3 dots followed by nothing. Marcus received one in the late hours. A single line, no name, no greeting. "Some things aren't worth airing." The screen's light showed his face, sharp and unready. He felt the scale of danger tilt. Price, meanwhile, circled. He had a way of asking questions that sounded like care. He would show up at the station with a file and a smile. He would be there at community meetings, listening. His presence felt like weather, predictable storms. When Paul suggested Price might have been too quick to arrest, Price said nothing that admitted fault. Instead, he offered, "We'll recheck the case. If there's doubt, we close it." His hands, when he gestured, were always sure. Marcus's dilemma tightened like a rope around his breath. If he pushed, he might clear his name and expose the ugly mechanics that had moved like cogs beneath the street. He might also drag his mother and David into a fight with people who did not use rules to win. If he did nothing, the lie would rust into reputation, and his chances at the firm and elsewhere would calcify into fewer doors. Sleepless nights gave him thin decisions. Call the firm, tell them the truth. Go live with Sarah at a friend's until things settled. Take Paul's offer of a quiet settlement to avoid a trial. Each possibility had a cost. Marcus weighed them and found that every cost carried other lives. He thought about the watch, how small and honest it had been when his uncle signed the engraving. The watch had become a ledger, keeping account of favors and favors owed, of choices people had been shoved into by hunger or fear. One evening, he stood on the roof of his building and watched the town like a model. Lights punctured the dark, car headlights drew thin rivers. He thought of justice as something that is not always equal to the law. Sometimes justice asks for risk. Sometimes it asks for mercy. He held the watch in his hand and felt its familiar tick. The decision, when it finally settled, did not arrive as a blaze, but as a hard-edged resolve. Marcus recognized that the truth would require him to step into the light and to pull at threads that could unravel more than his own reputation. He was not sure yet whether the town would thank him or punish him for pulling on those threads. But he knew that staying silent might leave others' hands free to make the next lie. That knowledge tightened the knot in his chest, but it also gave him something like a compass. They set the hearing in the community center because the room at the courthouse would feel cold and strange. Here the smell of coffee and old varnish made the air human. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors made the space feel small and close. Someone had draped a banner for a local charity across the back wall, and the contrast, goodwill behind a crowd ready for truth, felt sharp. Marcus sat at the table with Paul beside him. The watch lay in front of him on a cloth, a small bright circle in the middle of everything. Sarah stood behind him like a steady tree. David slouched near the door, hands folded, eyes on the floor. Officer Daniel Price sat across from them with a file, too neat to be innocent. Liam Parker lingered at the back, a shape that made people step just a little further from him. Helen Carter watched too, her face a mask that did not quite fit the woman who had cried on the street. Paul began, quietly, the way someone begins a story you should listen to. He played the video from the neighbor's doorbell. The small screen showed David slipping something into Helen's hand beneath a street lamp. The clip was grainy and brief, but the gesture had a clarity that felt like a confession. The room held its breath. Even the air seemed to lean in. Marcus felt his pulse in his throat. The watch beside him clicked patiently, as if time itself was choosing to be honest. Then Paul opened the phone records. There were messages from Helen's phone to an unknown number and receipts showing cash transfers. One of the receipts, hard proof, traced to a cash service that had sent confirmation to David's phone. The paper made the accusation look like a cheap costume, staged, purchased. There was a murmur in the room that could be read as shock or relief or both. Someone in the front row, Mrs. Langley, spoke up. Her voice, used to calling neighbors in from the rain, cut the hum. "We saw it all," she said simply, "but we also saw how things get set up. This town's got corners where money buys stories. We can't let that be the law." Her words landed like a bell. People nodded. Faces changed. Curiosity sharpened into resolve. David stood then, because standing felt like the only honest posture left. He said Marcus's name like an apology he had not trusted before. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry," he said. He told the room about Liam's men, about the threats and the cigarettes, and a voice that said, "Make it happen, or we take what's left." He spoke about fear, about a boy who thought protection was a fast math problem with the wrong answer. He said, "I thought I could fix it alone. I'm sorry, Marcus. I was a coward." Marcus watched him and felt a complicated thing, the old sting of betrayal braided with a tender, sudden pity. David's face had the raw honesty of a child who had been made into an adult too soon. Marcus could have shouted. He could have walked out. Instead, he folded his hands and let the room hear the truth for more than papers. He let David say the thing that untied the lie. Paul then produced a piece of evidence that changed the air again, Price's shift log paired with an anonymous phone call trace. The call had been routed through a payphone down by Liam Parker's arcade. The time stamped nearly matched the messages. Price's face was the color of paper. He opened his mouth, and the words came fragile and small. He tried to explain proximity, routine patrol, the smell of chance. But the pattern was tight and sensible. The room watched a man whose neat story had a ragged edge. Liam moved then. He rose like someone hearing a verdict and decided to make his own. He stepped forward, and a hush rushed to the doorway. Someone hissed for him to sit. He laughed a thin laugh, too loud. "You really think you're safe here?" he asked, looking at Marcus. The question was a threat disguised as curiosity. Sarah did not flinch. She took 2 steps forward, and the room felt the weight of a mother's courage. "You will not frighten us," she said. Her voice was clear. It carried the low authority of love that had nothing to do with law. A man from the local paper who had been watching all morning reached for his phone. A neighbor with a camera leaned in. The crowd refused to let Liam's shadow grow. Price stood then, and his hands betrayed him by trembling. "I was doing my duty," he told them. But the duty had become a ladder, and he had climbed where ambition made the steps feel righteous. Now his ladder creaked. The chief, who had been forced into the room by a call Paul had made, spoke in a voice that felt like judgment. "There will be an internal review," she said. The words were thinly bureaucratic and also final. Price's badge felt suddenly heavy at his chest. In the next hours, phone lines buzzed and reporters asked sharper questions. Paul worked with a calm that turned paper into proof. Liam's men found themselves noticed by too many eyes. The small town's whispering network turned outward like a flare. The chief's phone calls became the sound of closure assembling. By evening, Price was suspended pending investigation. Liam got a visit from people who preferred city suits to small-town bluster. Helen's tearful certainty faltered into the embarrassed silence of someone who had been paid to play a part. Marcus did not feel like a conqueror. He felt raw, tender, and a little unstitched. He hugged Sarah until both of them laughed and cried in the space between. David stood apart, then walked up and took Marcus's hand like someone asking for work to mend a bridge. "I'll live with you," David said clumsily. I'll work. I won't ask you to forgive me, but I'll try to fix it." Marcus looked at him and saw a boy who still had time to be brave. He let his anger move into something harder to name, an understanding that people make choices when under pressure, and sometimes those choices wind up with people like him paying the cost. He saw prices fall as a consequence, not celebration. He felt relief, but also the weight of a town that still had work to do. Night came soft and honest. The watch ticked on Marcus's wrist again, not stolen but returned to its place. The crowd dispersed with a new story to carry, one where truth had found its way through money and fear. Marcus walked home with Sarah and David, and the city lights seemed less watchful and more like witnesses. He thought about justice and mercy tangled together, and how both are messy and human. He knew the fight was not wholly won. There would be hearings, questions, more faces to change. But in the small room of the community center, under ordinary lights, a clearing had opened. For the first time in days, Marcus felt the air around him breathe with him. The days that followed felt strange and soft, like a neighborhood after a storm when people step outside to see what held and what broke. The internal review moved faster than anyone expected. The chief read the evidence, video clips, messages, bank receipts, and she met Officer Daniel Price with a look that made the room suddenly small. Price's face fell as if the badge at his chest had been weighing him down for longer than he wanted to admit. Within a week, the town learned what the review had concluded: misconduct, abuse of authority, and a pattern of choosing stories that fit ambition over truth. Price was fired. The word landed in the paper like a stone and made ripples. Liam Parker and the men who worked for him did not fit as comfortably into public life after reporters and neighbors started to pay attention. City detectives followed up on the leads Paul had collected. Liam was arrested on charges connected to coercion and extortion. Helen Carter had to answer for her part. The mayor arranged a small restitution fund for those whose lives had been damaged by false accusations, and the town council promised more oversight for the police. Promises are fragile things, but when people repeated them in public meetings, their voices sounded like commitments. Marcus watched much of this from the side, feeling both relief and a strange, slow exhaustion. He had wanted the truth to come out, but the cost had been higher than he first imagined. David's family kept their house. Liam's grip loosened, but Marcus noticed small things he could not ignore. The way neighbors still glanced at two boys walking late at night, the careful way some shopkeepers watched the street when Marcus passed. Old habits of suspicion do not vanish overnight. Work came in unexpected ways. The design firm called with a quieter tone than before and asked if Marcus would still like to come in for a position. They said they had seen how he handled himself and that they wanted someone with his steadiness. It was not a reward for suffering, it was a door reopened. Marcus accepted, not because it fixed everything, but because it was a chance to move forward with skill and dignity. He thought of his uncle's laugh and felt the watch on his wrist like a marker of both what he had lost and what he had kept. Marcus's relationship with David was slow to mend. Forgiveness, Marcus learned, was not one moment, but a labor. David worked for Marcus's mother, helping in small jobs and saving what he could. He went to community meetings and talked about the pressures that had pushed him into a dark choice. People listened because he spoke honestly. He did not ask Marcus for immediate absolution. Instead, he offered effort. Marcus accepted that as a start. At night, Marcus sat on the small stair outside his building and thought about what had happened in the community center, the way crowds had shifted from gossip to witness, the way Mrs. Langley's steady voice had changed the tone of the room. He remembered the feeling of being handcuffed, the cold bite of the metal, and the small, patient tick of the watch beside him. He thought about David's apology and Helen's shame and Price's dismissal. Each outcome felt like part of a ledger that could not be perfectly balanced. He found himself returning again and again to one question: what is justice when the people who enforce it can misuse it? He had wanted Price held accountable, and he wanted protection for his family and neighbors from men like Liam. Yet he also knew Price had been a son, a man with choices he had made. Seeing him fired did not make Marcus feel triumphant. It felt like a necessary, grave thing, an acknowledgement that power must answer for its misuse. Marcus wanted systems to change, not only one headline. One afternoon, after the formalities were done, Marcus visited the small community center and found a patch of silence in a folding chair. He ran his thumb over the engraving on the back of the watch. James, 18. The letters were small and worn, but they kept the memory. He thought of his uncle's voice telling him to be steady and his mother's hands that had smoothed his hair that awful morning. He thought of David and how fear had taught him a terrible calculus: protect at all costs and trust is the first thing sold. Marcus spoke to a group of young people later that month. He did not stand on a soapbox. He spoke plainly about choices, about the pressure that makes people pick lies because fear feels faster than truth. He told them that courage sometimes looks like asking for help, sometimes like telling the truth, even when the room will turn cold. He did not preach. He told them what he had learned. Mercy and justice are not opposites. They are parts of the same architecture. Holding someone accountable need not be cruel if it opens space for change. That night, he walked home with Sarah and David. The air smelled of rain yet to fall. Streetlights made little halos on the pavement. They walked together without speaking much, the kind of silence that means more than words. Marcus felt tired, but he felt a steadier pulse in his chest than he had in weeks. The town was not healed. No town is healed after a wound like that, but a small clearing had opened. People had seen the truth and chosen to act on it. Marcus knew the watch could not undo the days of fear. It could, however, remind him why he would not let fear buy stories about other people. He slid the watch on and felt its tick against his skin, a small, honest noise. He breathed in the night and let the city be what it was: imperfect, stubborn, and sometimes capable of admitting its mistakes. That confession felt like the beginning of something durable, not a neat ending, but a path forward. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.